isn't the bio.
Hmm?
This isn't the bio.
The bottom.
Hmm?
At the bottom.
It's not the bottom. Hi, welcome to another episode of Meet the Author. And today we have David Garnes. Nice to have you, David.
Thank you, Jason. Nice to be here.
David wrote Waiting for the Train to Come In, a novel of World War II. And he also wrote From My Life, Travels and Adventures. And I really loved the book. David Garnes is the author of the memoir From My Life, Travels and Adventures, and After the War Was Over, Poems of an American Childhood. His work has also appeared in many anthologies, magazines, and newspapers. A second book of essays, Living My Life, More Travels and Adventures, will appear in the near future. A former English teacher and retired academic librarian, David Garnes resides in Connecticut. Well, that's important to say he resides in Connecticut because one of the things that David does is he's a guide at the Emily Dickinson Museum in Massachusetts, right?
Yes.
And also, you had won some awards as an author, is that correct?
I have. From the Connecticut Authors and Publishers
Association?
Yeah.
So tell us about what award you won on that.
Well, I've won in the every year CAPA, Connecticut Authors and Publishers
CAPA is Connecticut Authors and Publishers
Association, has a contest. And actually, for 2 years in a row, I've won the essay contest. I won first place one year and second place another.
Well, I read one that had to do with Elizabeth Taylor. Can you talk a little about that one?
Yeah, that's going to be in my next book, my next essay book. I had a lot of interesting experiences when I lived in New York, which I did for almost 20 years. And I was there back in the 60s and through the 70s. But at one point in the 1960s, her then husband, Richard Burton, was appearing in Hamlet. Uh-huh. And every night she used to go and go into the theater at the end of the play, and then they would come out from the stage door. Well, this phenomenon of hundreds of people gathering there every night started to take place. So one night, after seeing the show, I went out on the street by the stage door, and sure enough, out she came. I happened to be standing right near her, and her beauty so impressed me that, well, I've never forgotten it. And he was there with her too. But it was more the phenomenon of someone who could command the attention of hundreds of people every night. You know, there were police on horseback. And
so you wrote a little story, and I read it, about that incident.
That's right.
So I wanted to say that is almost like an impressionist artist. If I was going to compare it to an impressionist artist, that's somebody who's capturing a moment and does a painting of that. Instead of really telling a story, but capturing a moment.
Yeah, you're right.
And I saw that in your book on other things. You capture a certain moment, and you develop it, and you appreciate these small moments in life, which help you enjoy life more. We have to wake up and smell the coffee, appreciate the small moments.
Yeah.
And I saw that that's what you do in your writing style. So now tell us a little bit about your work at the Emily Dickinson Museum and how that has influenced you in your writing.
Well, it came about specifically when I retired from the University of Connecticut, where I was a librarian for 21 years. And I was thinking of something I might do that would be completely different from what I had done for the past, actually, 30 years, because I had been a librarian at Columbia in New York before that. And I decided to visit the Emily Dickinson, then called the Emily Dickinson Homestead. The reason was that I had done my graduate work on Emily Dickinson when I was at Columbia back in the early 1960s. And I've always kept up an interest in her. So the next thing I knew, I was leading tours up there. And then for a while, I was actually the house manager, briefly, with the understanding that I would only do it because the director was out on leave. And I've trained students, and I continue to go up there a couple of times a month. And I've been doing that now for 12 years. I retired about 12 years ago.
What about Emily Dickinson or her writings has influenced you as a writer? What did you learn from her?
Well, although she's a poet, I did actually have a book of poetry published, which we have here too.
You can hold that up.
Should I hold that one up and show it? This is the one that you did mention it. It was called After the War Was Over, Poems of an American Childhood. So I was drawn to her because of her poetry, and because you know how there are certain writers where you just feel you're kind of on the same wavelength. You can admire other writers, realize that they're great writers, but there are a few who really seem to speak to you, and she's one of them.
So I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah.
But what was it? I mean, you're an author. You have to explain these things.
What
was it about her that talked to you?
That talked to me. Well, first of all, her technique. She has this remarkable technique. She uses very startling images. She uses metaphor a lot. She's not afraid to tackle big subjects. At a time when women poets in the 19th century were not doing that. She was way ahead of her time. She was one of the first to experiment with not exactly rhyming in all of her poems. I liked how she was constantly searching.
For her time? She was avant-garde for her time?
Yeah, she was. Of course, nothing that she published, well, about 12 poems were published during her lifetime. She wasn't known during her lifetime. They only discovered the 1,800 poems after she died, really.
Oh, wow.
So, for a variety of reasons, I took to her. And I still find inspiration, if you will, when I am up there. I never tire of reading her poetry. I was just up there today, in fact. We're closed right now until March 1st for the part of the winter. But we had a guides meeting today, and we were talking about some of her poetry. And every time I read her, I find something new. She's a writer I have never
We'll have to have her on the show.
Have her on the show. She won't come.
She's
very reclusive.
She's very reclusive.
Yeah.
The ghost of Emily Dickinson. So, tell us about your book, and I want you to read a chapter from the book.
Okay. This is from my life.
And when was that published?
This was published about 3 years ago.
Okay.
About 3 years ago. And I can explain briefly what it is. It's a collection of 22 essays. Now, originally, when I was thinking of this book, I really was motivated to do it because of...
Well, 22 essays of what?
Well, that's what I'm going to tell you. I was going to do essays strictly having to do with my travels. I used to travel a lot. Particularly when I lived in New York, I would work. I would finish my last day of work before my vacation, having taken my suitcase to the office at the library at Columbia, and then I would hop on the subway, get out to JFK, and take off and spend a week or two in Europe. And I always took not just notes, I really kept a journal, kind of a narrative of every place I had been.
So how many countries, or just shoot off some countries you had been to?
Well, all of the British Isles. I've been to London many times in particular, but I have relatives in Scotland, so I've been all through Scotland. France, Spain. I think I've been to most European countries. I have not been to Scandinavia, but I've been to Russia, and then I've been to Mexico, Hawaii, Puerto Rico several times.
Wow.
So, a lot. Canada, of course. But.
So I wanted to mention, because I had also been to about 18 different countries and also wrote a memoir, and I appreciate the work that David did in the book From My Life, because I know what a good job he did explaining all the experiences you have when you go to visit another country.
Well, thank you.
What really, and he's going to read a piece of that right now, but what really caught me, you went to Russia in the 1970s. Today it's a popular site, especially with the Olympics coming up.
Yeah.
But like for an American to go to Russia in the 1970s, and it was a shock, right?
It was, and you absolutely had
scary
to go.
Too.
It was, yes, it was. You had to go with a tour group. I don't know if people could have gone independently, but I went with this tour group, and we were met by the in-tourist guides at the airport. It was so regulated that even our tour guides from America who accompanied us on the airplane, they didn't know what hotels we would be assigned to until we arrived there.
Well, I'm going to tell you something because I lived abroad for many years too. And I would always say I would come back to the States for visits, and I would hear Americans, like especially today, complain about their country. And this was my favorite term, well, why don't you visit another country for a week?
Yeah.
I would say every American should visit another country for a week and then come back here and kiss the ground you're on.
Yeah, you bet.
So tell us about that episode. You can read us a little bit about it.
So anyway, so I did go when they were really just starting to open up, general tours for people like me who just wanted to go someplace interesting. So the first essay that I wrote here, I called it Red Memories. And I was actually there in 1976.
Wow.
So I'm just going to read a few sentences and then skip down and
Who
read
was the American president at that time?
In 76, who was the
Remember?
president? No.
Was it Reagan yet? No.
Let's see, we could figure it out.
Because we had
Kennedy
the détente and all that.
Yeah. It was definitely during a period of détente.
Probably Ford. 79 was Reagan. I think it was Ford or Carter.
Yeah. Let's see. It wouldn't have been. It was after. Yes. It had to be Reagan. I would guess. I'm not sure though.
Okay. Okay.
If I thought about it and figured it out, I could go forward from Kennedy's assassination.
Well, it's important because Reagan was involved with the détente,
Yeah.
and maybe that's why they opened up to
Well, they
Americans.
were really encouraging tourists, and nothing happened. Well, yes, something did happen, actually. I mean, nothing happened that I knew of when I was there, but I discovered after I got home that something had happened, and I don't want to say what that something is.
Okay.
However, let me just read a couple of sentences when I begin, and then I'll skip down and read just a little bit about what happened in the airport. I spent 10 days in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in the winter of 1976. When I visualize that trip now, I'm left mostly with images of Dr. Zhivago-like snowy weather, bulbous cathedral domes, and rosy-faced Muscovites in big fur hats. But when I really think back, I have a slightly different take. What creeps into my mind, like the ugly underbelly of a pretty stage prop, are glimpses of the old red menace that was the dark side of the Iron Curtain. And then I say a little bit more, but I'll just skip down here. It all began in the Moscow airport, where our arriving tour group found itself confronting a veritable platoon of armed customs officials. Notice I said armed customs officials. These weren't military, but they were all armed.
They were government agents.
Probably, yeah. As I approached the uniformed agents, affecting the confident yet cooperative attitude one assumes in such situations, I was brusquely motioned to open my luggage. 15 minutes later, I was left with 2 empty suitcases, contents tossed helter-skelter on the examination table. I'd just been subjected to a search worthy of a bomb squad at a suspected terrorist site.
Well, if you think, I'll explain something about that. If you think about it from a bureaucratic point of view, it keeps them in a job. They're busy searching your luggage,
and there were plenty of them. It was keeping quite a few
people. It's a bureaucracy,
in the job.
What do you think communism was? It was a bureaucracy.
I don't know what it's like now to go. Of course, it's not the Union of Soviet.
It's capitalistic more than we are.
But anyway, they looked through everything. They squeezed my toothpaste.
Yep.
I mean, they looked through everything.
So it's a very uncomfortable feeling if you think they didn't know. They wanted to have tourists, but they didn't yet know how to start the industry.
So it really wasn't a friendly greeting, welcoming. However, I had a wonderful time. I mean, the in-tourist guides were
beautiful country.
Excellent. The country was beautiful. As I said, we were there in the winter. And then I did discover something after I got back relating to an incident that had happened when I was there that really was kind of chilling. But I'm not going to tell you what that is.
Well, that's okay. So tell us about another chapter.
Well, I could read. Well, since you asked me about my time at the Emily Dickinson Museum, I could read I could read a little bit from that chapter. I called it That Whiter Host because she refers to a whiter host in one of her poems. At Home with Emily Dickinson. Now, I wrote this in 2009, so it's fairly contemporary. For nearly a decade, I've been a guide at the Emily Dickinson Museum, birthplace of America's greatest poet. That's my opinion, but I'm not the only one who feels that way. As a lifelong lover of all things Dickinson, I've snagged a dream assignment. Not only do I get to spend time in her parlor and bedroom and gardens, I'm also able to commune with other aficionados about our favorite writer and her incredible story, and I'm paid for it in the bargain. And then I continue on, and I talk about, actually I focus a little bit on the period where I was the house manager, which entailed my arriving early, making sure I could get in with the security, deactivating the security system, getting everything ready, getting the cash out of the safe, and so forth and so on, and then closing up at night. And let me just read this. I never walk up the drive without experiencing a thrill at the thought that I'm about to enter the place where Emily Dickinson wrote virtually all her poetry. Surely no house in American literary history is more closely associated with its occupant than this one, particularly in light of the poet's reclusiveness in her later years. And then I go on to talk about some of my experiences there. But I enjoyed writing this essay, partially because at the time I wrote it, I was writing it from my very recent experiences there.
And we'll let you read one more. You said about your visiting your grandmother.
My grandmother, yeah,
in Scotland.
In Scotland, I took her back.
You took her back
to Scotland. Back to Scotland. I put this essay at the very end because I felt it's probably my favorite, and I felt I was connected emotionally to it. And in fact, people have told me that that's the one that they remember also.
Okay.
So I'll just read a little bit. This is called Time Travel, and it's 1968, meaning that was the time that I took her back. 57 years. That's a long time to have been gone from the place you called home, but maybe it doesn't seem that way if you chose to leave in the first place. My grandmother, get ready for this name, Sarah Rose Tyre Gordon Monroe Macaulay, Garnes, set out from Scotland in 1911, sailing by steamer across the North Atlantic in search of a better life in America. It wasn't until 1968 that she returned to the old country, this time on a sleek British Overseas Airways jet. And then I talk about our experience on the airplane, and how.
So, from all the countries you have been to, which was your prettiest country that you liked them? From not talking about your adventure, but what you enjoyed scenically. What did you enjoy the most?
I think this just came off here. Am I okay now? Should I hold it?
Yeah, you can hold it.
Yeah, let me just hold it. Scenically, Hawaii.
Oh, well, yeah.
Hawaii, and I'll tell you why. Hawaii surprised me because the first time I went, I had no idea. I imagined that I'd be spending all my time, on beaches with palm trees and, you see the surfers and so forth on Waikiki Beach. Mm-hmm. What really impressed and surprised me, though, was that what I was much more conscious of were the mountains that rise in the back.
The volcanic mountains?
Yeah, the volcanic mountains and the mix of the green of the terrain and then the gray mountains and the clouds.
That's why they make such good paintings. People love to, artists love to paint those type of paintings.
And I had not imagined that I would be greeted by those mountains. And when you're in Hawaii, whatever island you're on, all you can really see are the mountains. Mm-hmm. You see the mountains constantly.
Really give them justice in a photo.
Correct.
You have to see in person.
You have to get that, probably the depth and the size of them.
The depth
so from a visual standpoint, I would say Hawaii. It's not the most interesting place I think I've been, but visually it's the most beautiful.
Still in the USA.
And yes, it is. But of course, it's pretty different,
So one thing that interests me, because I also wrote a memoir, so you talk about what the difference between, for getting back to authoring, what's the difference between an autobiography and a memoir in the writing and in the topics?
Yeah, that's a good...
You wrote an autobiography or you wrote a memoir?
No, this is a memoir. This is a collection of memoir essays. What really... Well, first of all, an autobiography, I think, if you're really writing a full autobiography, you pretty much... You put in virtually everything that, in other words, anything that is relevant. In a memoir, however, you have the option of picking and choosing what you want to write about. I mean, you can focus on... I could have written about my whole experience in Russia, but I chose to focus on this one particular incident. I could have written about my grandmother. If I were to write my autobiography, my grandmother would play a large role, as she did in my life. But I chose in this memoir piece just to write about the experience of taking her back to Scotland. Mm-hmm. So that's really the difference. What I find even more interesting is the difference between memoir and fiction. Because in memoir, although you focus on something in particular, you're still telling the truth. I mean, you are relating what happened to you. I think it's permissible to put some dialogue in that relates to what happened, even if it happened a long time ago, because, something like that happened. But, you're telling the truth, and you can get into trouble, as we know people have, for writing memoirs that turn out to be fabrication. Mm-hmm. The freeing part of a novel is that you can take some incident, you can draw from your life, but you're free to change it as you want.
And it's a novel, so no one can say, that's not true.
That's not true. And I found that a very difficult realization to come. It was hard to make that leap and say, hey, I don't have to have the story come out the way that I remember from,
in my case, I wrote a memoir that was factual, and but I wrote it in a novelistic way, and I called it a non-fiction novel, which we know Truman Capote wrote in that style. And I would tell people I have a non-fiction novel, they say, well, it's either fiction or it's not, and they didn't really get that idea that you can write a memoir and a novel, but you can do it. You can do a memoir in a novel way, but it's still true.
That's right.
So
and In Cold Blood was the big one.
In Cold Blood, it was a non-fiction novel. Right. People said, well, that's actually the first time someone wrote a non-fiction novel.
Yeah.
So he specialized in that.
Yeah. He was very smart to market it that way. Not only was it a great book, but it was presented as something new. Mm-hmm. And I think he was very smart to do that.
Mm-hmm. And this I really like, this question here. This also I have experience with. You said your book is a collection of both travel pieces and others you call adventures. Did it start out that way? Well, actually, let me add to the other question. Your recollections of incidents in your travels, some of which go back decades, is surprisingly detailed. How did you reconstruct the episodes? And the reason why I'm asking, I think that's an important question, is because I had the same issue with my memoir. I was able to remember things that happened 10, 20 years ago, and to my surprise and chagrin, I was able to exactly write it down and remember it idea for idea, moment for moment. It was like amazing that I was able to do that. So what was your take on that?
That's a very good question. Well, what really helped me, well, first of all, I wrote about things that were memorable. So, as you said...
So it hit a thing in your memory.
You really tend to remember certain things. However, what really helped me was that, as I mentioned before, I think, I wrote journals. When I would come back to I don't even want to say, sometimes I stayed in a hotel. Often it was a bed and breakfast. In my really younger years, I stayed in hostels.
So you did journaling?
I did journaling every night.
Notes.
I took notes, but I also just did journal narrative. So if I were doing that in the evening after the experience, I could even, of course, put down dialogue. So I had plenty of real dialogue.
Why would you do that? Well, I can guess because you're an English major and you thought maybe one day you're going to write a book about this.
Yeah, I
Not
think
many people think about that.
I'll tell you why I did it. I partially did it, but I also wanted to be able to have my family look at it. And sort of, it was a way of kind of saying, here, you want to read the journal of my trip?
So whereas somebody else might have took a small movie,
I did it.
You did it by writing because you were a writer by profession, by major. Very interesting.
And then the second thing that you asked,
just like an artist would draw a scene of the travel place that he went to, for memories keep.
That's right. You would do it, or someone might write a piece of music, that inspired them.
Okay, that inspired them from visiting that place. So
Same thing.
Person used the medium. That's very interesting. You brought that up. People use the medium to capture the moment.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that until you asked me the question.
Journaling is a thing we teach in creativity to teach people, especially with art or writing. You want to keep a journal. You want to write the things down because you never know in the future if you're going to write your story or paint that painting or make that music,
right?
Or write an article for a newspaper. So you definitely want to keep a journal with you. And that is one of the success tools of great people. They have journals. They keep journals.
Yeah, I'm so glad. It was like a treasure. I still, of course, I still have them. But the other question that you asked about how the title changed from My Life Travels to From My Life Travels and Adventures, I decided. I started out originally thinking I would just write about real travels.
Book.
No, it's not a guide to how to get along in Paris, for example. But it was
$5 a day.
Yeah, and I was still I
in those days it was $5 a
day. I could have been not Fromer's version, but David Garnes' version. But I decided to expand it because I realized that I wanted to write about some things that I had experienced that weren't exactly travels to foreign countries, but interesting things that happened to me here in the United States.
And who do you think your audience is going to be? Why did you even want to write this? Okay, so you wrote it for your family, and you captured these stories, but why did you write it? Who did you think your audience was going to be? And what have you heard from people that read it?
Yeah, I really wrote it probably more when I actually got to doing this book. I mean, the journals I kind of did partially so my family could read. But when I did the essays for this book, I think I was really doing it for myself, to be honest. I mean, I was at a point in my life where I wasn't interested in necessarily having a best-selling book, and that would have been nice. But I just found it, I love to write, and I just found it very fulfilling to recreate those trips or those adventures. And
so why would so if you say you did it for yourself, why would somebody else be interested?
Because I think everyone has an interesting story or two or three or four to tell. And so I think that when people can be motivated when they read what someone else has done and they actually see that they have been able to produce a book. I think it gives people inspiration that, hey, maybe I can do that myself. Or they had been to Crete, or they had been to Mexico, or Hawaii, or the other places that I write about. And they can relate to it too. They can relate to their own time there.
That's pretty interesting because John Wayne actually said that in one of the Second World War movies as the introduction. He said everybody has an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, and most people think they don't.
But they do.
But they do.
But they just have to learn how to capture it.
Everyone has an interesting story.
I'm going to intercede for a second and say, number one, well, you kept a journal, but today what I do is it has a recorder. And I would record ideas in my smartphone. If something's important that I want to remember later on, to put into a book. So I keep my ideas.
And you can do that anywhere.
And you can do that anywhere. So today, you don't even, if you don't like to write, you can keep your journal.
That's good.
With a tape recorder, and that's pretty cool. what have people said, people who read your stories, what have people told you?
I think I've probably had more comments about the story that ends the book, the one about taking my grandmother back to Scotland. People really seem to like that. It may have struck a chord in terms of their relationship with a grandparent.
You know, you bring up something very interesting, and we're in a country of immigrants. And they all came from the mother country, you know, a lot of people here. And they came to America, but we didn't give up our connection or roots in the other countries we came from.
That's right.
And you see that by all the restaurants ethnic restaurants that people go to. And so it's very important, you know, to bring one of your family members who came here and help them go back to their roots. Because just because they came here doesn't mean they totally negated everything over there. They just came for a better life. But
my grandmother was very much, she retained her Scots heritage. She was very proud of being from Scotland. And she never said, I'm from Britain. It was Scotland.
It was Scotland.
It was Scotland. And when I was a little boy, I was very close to my grandmother. And I remember telling her several times, when I grow up, I'm going to take you back to Scotland.
Very nice.
And I don't think she ever
took you seriously.
No. But I did. That's really one of the things I'm very happy that I did. It made her very happy. Interestingly, though, here's something interesting about that trip. When we left, I thought she would really be devastated to leave. Her favorite sister had gone back and was still in Scotland, had lived in Scotland. And I thought, and they knew that that was the last time they'd probably see each other when we left. I thought it would be really difficult for her. But as soon as we got on the plane, I think she was anxious to get home. So in a way, home
back to Scotland or home back to America?
Home back to America. Because see, her family, her own family was there.
Because even though she came from there, it's a visit now. But her home, you know, home is where you make it.
Yeah.
It's not exactly where you came from, but it's...
And she was a very strong person, so...
Her family was here now.
But her family was over here.
Well, David, it was a very interesting episode.
Are we finished? For goodness sake.
Finished. Time flies by.
Yes, it sure did. Thank you so much,
you read
Jason.
a couple chapters. You talked about your life. We talked about all these different countries. Time flies by.
This was a lot of fun. I thank you for asking me.
You didn't have to keep a memoir just because it's going to be on YouTube.
There you go. There you go.
It's archival. So
thank you, Jason.
Thank you.